Hey, Catherine, good to see ya once again.
Yeah. How are things in Wyoming?
Cold. Too cold.
Really?
Yeah, it just
Oh,
doesn't stop over here.
okay. Okay. Well,
We do what we can. So,
uh,
once again, I'm really excited to get to chat with you. It's such a pleasure to get to learn a little bit more about you and your work and where you come from. But before we get to talking about your latest project, which is Where Elephants Weep, I'd like to ask you a few questions about where you began as a human being and as an artist, if that's okay.
I would love that. And I love the preface where I began as a human being, because in the end, that is in fact something that we all humans share, is that given all the different possibilities, we are, all of us humans, or not the animals, but the humans are humans.
That's right.
So
That's
thank
right.
you.
And listening to some of your conversations that you've had on some podcasts before as well, I got a clear sense of almost a mission statement happening very, very early in life for you, especially given where you grew up. Can you tell me about your parents in particular and the California that you grew up in? Because it feels like that sort of influenced your origins quite a bit.
Yes, thank you. So my father sailed a catamaran across the Atlantic Ocean, and that was the first time that had happened. And he was from the very center of France. So in what they call the sort of backwater uh, part of France, not a great reputation. People thought of those people as sort of hicks.
Mm.
And why he had the desire to go and sail is just part of the mystery. And so then when he arrived, he then embarked on building one of the first laminated fiberglass sailboats, and unfortunately had somewhat of a tragedy occur with that boat.
Mm.
And that brought him to San Diego, California, where he became an oceanographer. So then my mother's side of the family was from Algeria, and they were what is called Pieds Noirs. And she then came to the United States with him. And in a thing that's a bit hard to understand, she didn't really know the country of France as her own country. Algeria
Mm.
was her country. And as you may know, in 1962, it got its independence, and she never returned to her homeland.
Mm.
So then, four of us, we were four siblings, grew up in that strange environment in which we had parents who were constantly trying to understand, and we were in the front lines of explaining, for example, why people ate peanut butter. That seemed very strange to them. And my older brother was front and center in command of explanations. And if he couldn't explain it, I was next. And so it was really kind of a free for all from the beginning in terms of what we were all learning and understanding. And then, so French was my first language. However, early on, my father and mother loved Mexico. And so we were on our way to Mexico in our old station wagon. So we would camp for long periods of time. We actually drove all the way down to the Yucatan and to
Mm.
Chiapas,
Wow.
and we loved Mexico very much. And we got to see Jaime, a part Mexico. We would camp in Baja. It was just incredibly beautiful,
Mm.
and there was nothing. It was just us, tents, and the salami we brought along to eat. And then we ate a really wonderful shrimp and things like that we bought from the fishermen. So anyway, we loved that. But what I immediately saw when you would cross the border is the very different economic situation from one
Hmm.
side to the other. And so by that point, the sort of whirlwind of cultures and languages and inexplicable questions that were lurking all around became sort of my middle name. I
Mm-hmm.
just was trying constantly, and I didn't really think that I came from a background. Maybe it's the Cartesian French, where children are not really supposed to impart their grand opinions. So really, I was sort of like everything was questioned.
Ah,
Um, yeah, and that's probably one of the things that made me become a writer. You know?
sure, sure.
So
So your relationship with language seems to be a very interesting one, and specifically about that, could you elaborate just a moment about your mother? You had mentioned in another podcast how she was a very literate person. She pursued that quite a bit. Could you share a bit about some of the lessons that you picked up along the way from your mother in terms of that language and its power? And we can get into opera as well, because I believe that was something that she imparted to you as well, that love, but it's specifically about language.
So yes, my mother, as you know, was French, but when she got to this country, and I don't think that originally, like at the beginning, they planned to stay,
Mm,
but they unclear. But as she stayed, she became very passionate about being utterly bilingual. And when I was a little girl, she would say, "Catherine, when I make a mistake, please correct me." So I did, and then she got extremely upset. So I was like, I guess she didn't really want me to correct her, but she loved English, and she was very involved in literature and read widely, and really by the end of her life was somebody that I thought to be one of the most bilingual people. But this is a little bit of a curveball. I was wondering if I could read to you a small poem that I wrote for her.
absolutely. Yeah, that would be a pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it really will embody everything that you're asking me. So it's called The Clementine, and the day before I left California for New York, my mother peeled me a clementine, one skillful, never-ending peel which she formed into a rose on top and presented to me with the words, "Voilà, ma chère, avec mes compliments." She, my quiet, ardent admirer, had learned the skill of orange peeling from my grandfather in Algeria, their native place, amidst the clementine groves of Misergine near Oran. His shadow haunted the room when she presented me his orange rose. So the reason I wanted to read that is because, I when one talks, and you know this better than anyone, when one talks about writing, it's really not the same thing as what writing in fact is, you
Hmm.
know. And that poem for me embodies so many things that are so emotional and in many ways tragic. Some of the things that we lose when
Hmm.
we leave our homelands, and when we become. She thought of herself to be in exile, and when we when we make choices, and I think that all of my work, which I never knew was really happening as I was going on, is about these choices that people have to make, oftentimes because of war, where I work with many, many survivors, and they didn't know that they were going to have to make the choices that they made, and they
Hmm.
find themselves in different lands and different cultures, um, and we carry that with us, and
Absolutely.
there's nothing we can really do about that.
Yeah. And it is such a powerful work that you shared with me and the listener. Thank you so much. But to see if we can converge things a little bit with this social purpose as well as your playwriting, when did you feel like this was going to be a path for you moving forward as a playwright, stage storyteller, converging into these really important social issues?
Yes. So I started as an actress and I loved acting and the truth of the matter is I was a bad actress. I was just not suited for that. However, I feel that, and I'm sure you can relate as a playwright, that in a way one can't really know what it's like to be a playwright. One does need to know what it's like to be the person that has the words, the responsibility of your words. And
Mm-hmm.
so I did, I yearned to be in the theater very, very much. And why that was, probably that I had no voice. And you mentioned you do a lot of poetry related things for your podcast. And I started as a poet. That was the
Mm.
absolute first thing I did. But then I must have wanted to get those words out there in a different way. And so from acting, I went into playwriting. And the playwriting, all we can really do as playwrights is be a voice. And one of the first stories that came to me was I was handed an article about a group of women in Long Beach, California, who suffered from psychosomatic blindness after what they witnessed during the Khmer Rouge. And I looked at the article and the photograph and I thought to myself, well, how can that be possible?
Mm.
Maybe since my father is a scientist, that was a way that I could be like, well, I'm not a scientist, but like, how could the brain waves be moving and the eyes not be working? And that just became like, in a way, a lifelong journey, because to understand that
Mm.
is to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, is to understand culture clash and then U.S. complicity, which
Mm-hmm.
is at the core of what happened with Cambodia.
Yeah, and this is something fascinating that I wanted to ask you about because it seems like the idea specifically of what happened in Cambodia initially is almost jettisoned into storytelling as a way to share these causes, but you're not coming back to it. So this was something that you had with you early on, but now you're coming back to it and kind of seeing it in a new light with the play. Can you tell me about the first work that you put together and how that contrasts with where you are now in this new production of Where Elephants Weep?
Mm. So the first play was Eyes of the Heart, and it was a family story about a blind woman who comes to be with her family in Long Beach, California, and is completely a stranger in a strange land, an outsider, and in the most quintessential way, and is also trying to get help from a white eye doctor who is completely at the other end of the spectrum, which is very similar to me and my own story in terms of trying to understand, and then how these people actually come together and in some way join. Well, she joining the world for my main character Tita is the what happens to her. And people always ask at the end of the productions of the play, well, did the women see again? And that remains somewhat of a question. And in terms of what you're asking, I think with Where Elephants Weep, which is the opera, um, there are certain questions that will not be ever answered, and that similar questions remain at the end of Where Elephants Weep.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So specifically about Where Elephants Weep, this is a very peculiar project because it is a rock opera in a culture that has suffered a lot, that has gone through some horrific events in recent memory. And I'm curious of how this project came together because it culminated in its initial presentation in 2008. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm curious what the lead up to that premiere was so that we can talk about this revival and how you found your way into this collaboration and what that was like.
Yes. So, in addition to being a playwright, I am a librettist also, which means I write the words for opera. And I had already written an opera called The Floating Box, which was about oral histories that the composer and I had taken. And I was approached for this Where Elephants Weep project by a producer called John Burt and the composer who was at the forefront of this project, Him Sopi. And Him Sopi is a Cambodian composer, and they had a loose story, and from there we developed it. I met him in I think 2001 or something
Mm-hmm.
like that, and so it was really. I think also it's important to say that opera can take a very long time. Plays take a long time. Operas can take even longer. So we had just the very basics of the story of two young Cambodian American men who are survivors of the genocide who decide to go back to their country.
Mm.
And then along the way, we decided we were going to loosely base it, very, very loosely base it on Tum Tive, which is a kind of Romeo and Juliet story, very traditional Cambodian story. And we were going to tell that story. And then Him Sopi decided that it would be very good to have 27 traditional Cambodian instruments in an orchestra and a Cambodian rock and roll band. And of course, you know that Cambodia, before the genocide, had a tradition of rock and roll, and but it's their own hybrid version,
Mm.
and that as you may also know, 80 to 90% of the artists died during the Khmer Rouge regime.
That's horrific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have this extraordinary person, Him Sopi, who survives the Khmer Rouge regime, and then so that was 75 to 79. So in the early 80s, he manages to get to Moscow, Russia,
Mm.
to get an education in music, and he gets a PhD in Moscow, where his PhD thesis is the traditional instrumentation of Cambodian music. So already, this is a person who had to learn a whole new language, Russian, and then do his PhD. And then when he came back, he was ready to go in terms of writing this score for this opera.
Mm-hmm.
And so the score involves what I mentioned, the rock and roll band, the traditional instrumentation. We are creating the story together. I am writing the words. And then ultimately, all of that is being scored for the opera. And then we decide that we also want it to be in English and in Khmer. So
Mm.
that means that everything, if the performers are singing in Khmer, we have English surtitles, and if they're singing in English, we have Khmer surtitles. So it's completely. And when you see the Broadway on demand capture, you will see all of that, which makes it a super embracing multicultural project.
That's beautiful because it was, I mean, even 15 years ago, when it first came out, I mean, that was a pretty forward-thinking sort of way of producing work. So that I got to applaud you for that. But beginning in the early 2000s, when this started to become something more than Embers, what kind of trepidation did you have going into this? Because I know that by this point, you had a lot of experience working with oral cultures, doing research and producing work that was related to a lot of these social causes. But tackling something of this scope, Were there some concerns on your end of problems that needed to be solved that sort of kept you up at night more than others?
Mm. Well, yes, and I think that the problems that kept I had some, and then there was an entire team of people that had problems that kept them up at night, I'm sure. so, so nobody was getting much sleep. No, no.
7 years straight of no sleep.
Yeah. I mean, for one, you just have to bring up, one just has to bring up the work of opera because you're going back and forth between words and music. So we threw out a lot of songs. I mean, just the other day, Sophie was telling me about a song we had called Empty Orchestra, which was actually based on karaoke because karaoke is a big deal in Cambodia. And so we had this song and he was like, remember Empty Orchestra? I was like, oh my God, I actually forgot about that. Yeah. So there's just an endless amount of work, because you write something and it doesn't fit into the story, or if it just doesn't work, or, so mixing and matching and working and then people listening that come in and going, anything from that sounds terrible to that's just not going to work for whatever reason, or
Yeah.
So it's just those kinds of things for the librettist are a big thing, because you're constantly trying to redo the story and try to figure out how to make it better and try to make it more dramaturgically successful. So those are things that would keep me up at night. I did a lot of rhyming, so I was very involved in looking at versification and rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the big picture, along the way, there was simply the thing of how to keep us together. Sophie lives in Cambodia. I'm here. I went there to work on it. He came here. The producer, John Burt, was really, you have to put someone like that in the category of a saint, because somebody like that is just shepherding the project and constantly being like, oh, well, this is going to take a bit longer than we thought, those kinds of things. So the ramp up was that we decided to workshop it in Lowell, Massachusetts, because that's where one of the largest Cambodian American communities is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we did it at Lowell High School. And Lowell High School is a super big high school. And the community, through a big consortium of people, came together to kind of embrace the workshop of Where Elephants Weep, which was our first opportunity to see it fully sort of on its feet with the orchestra.
And what year was that?
That was the year, right? 2007.
Wow.
So basically we did it there. We saw a lot, it was good, but and it was very meaningful for the community there. They came out, there were like lines around the block, and
oh, great.
And there are a couple of performances, not a lot. And, I got feedback. I would listen. One man told me that the buffalo horn, which plays a big part, because it's a horn that's used to call elephants in the forest in Cambodia. He said that also for him, the buffalo horn represents the sound, represents something emotional that allows people, him and others, to cry.
Oh, wow.
So that was really interesting, and it was really, I think, a really great idea to do it there. And then the next year is when we brought it to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh.
That's so powerful. And in between that year, were there some things that you might consider dark moments in the production where you said, this isn't really gelling? There are things that we've learned from this workshop that just completely destroyed some notions that you thought were pretty surefire about the logic of the story or the structure of the play. Did you have some of those scenarios where you had to confront something that just clearly wasn't working in up to the premiere of the show?
Totally, tons. We had to go back to the drawing board. Um, the depiction of the monks has always been something. And when we do the revival in 2024, we're going to go back yet again and look at that.
Mm.
So that the love story, the end of the opera, what we decided to do. And again, we're going to look at the end of the opera again. So it's been a constant
Mm-hmm.
reorganization and refining with the whole team being completely involved. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
huge team.
So when the show premiered in Cambodia, I'm curious to know what the reaction was, and of course there was some backlash. If you could elaborate a little bit, and then I'll ask you some more about the some of the work that is to come. But what was that feeling like being with that audience and having the pleasure of them seeing that story?
Yes, so we rehearsed in Phnom Penh, and it was such an exciting rehearsal process. I mean, I've been in many, many rehearsal processes now, and I would say that this one was so special because you had uh, a series of Broadway performers from the United States. You had the top performers from Cambodia, a director from Canada, another director from Cambodia, choreographer from the U.S., but also choreographers from Cambodia, dancers, singers, um, a whole design team that was constantly, like every minute, trying to kind of figure out how to culturally vet every single thing. So, for example, if you're offering something in a temple, how is that done? And Yang Sitol, who played our lead, is also what's called an acha, and an acha is a lay person, religious entity who would,
Mm.
for example, facilitate at a wedding or something like that. So he is a Buddhist, and also Him Sopi is a Buddhist, and so everything was shown and reshown and worked on. So it wasn't, it's already hard to rehearse a play because, as you know, so there was all of that, and we kind of built it from the ground up, and then we were all living together during the
Mm.
entire time, and then we brought it from the rehearsal studio into the big space, and then we started building it there, and the tickets went on sale, and it was sold out immediately, and it was a big venue, and we had to add a performance
Mm.
because there was more audience, and then the idea was that it would be shown on national television, so it was filmed, and that is for that reason that we're going to be able to do the Broadway on demand, is that
Mm.
because oftentimes you don't get great, at least in the US, you don't get great film captures of live work,
Mm-hmm.
but in this case we did, and it was filmed and then also shown on television, and so the response was, um, I mean, I want to say this delicately. I mean, the response was incredible because people hadn't had an opportunity to see something of that kind of magnitude in terms of the combination of so many cultural uh, things. And it was also, it's an emotional story. It's a deeply moving story about womanhood, about what it's like to give something up, and the prices you pay, and it's about violence, and these are stories. I mean, yes, it's Cambodia, but it's also, these are universal stories that, frankly, now that we look at 2023, that are
Mm-hmm.
just happening everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's just such a beautiful opportunity that you folks had to bring that sort of joy and experience to people who have gone through a lot. But I'm curious because there were some concerns in terms of what needed to change in the script. I guess without giving much away, is there a way to mend the reasons for the backlash, the reasons for that censorship that took place at the time?
Well, so it showed on television, and then for one performance, it was supposed to have two, and then it was banned
Mm-hmm.
by the government.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, but I would say that the creators, Him Sopi, the composer, and then Yang Si-tol, who was also uh, very involved in the production, are Buddhists themselves and completely stood by the work of art.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, and I that's why I think it's really important for people to take a look at the Broadway on Demand, and see. I think that what I would like to say is that the political canvas of countries is very can be very idiosyncratic, and that we in the United States have our own political canvas, and the U.S. has the tendency, for reasons that I really don't understand, to go around and tell other people in the world, what they're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be doing, when in fact, we have not joined the ICC ourselves. We're not party to the International Criminal Court, and we haven't signed big climate change treaties or in the past. And so there are different gradations of what political statements mean. And I think that we all live within those constructs, and we make art.
Mm-hmm.
We make
Mm-hmm.
our art, and you may have somebody who comes to a play in the United States and gets there are issues in the US that are hugely volatile
Mm-hmm.
and that would send a certain audience member out of that theater very, very angry. And I've been in theaters in the US where there's been a play where afterwards, literally, it's like lighting a flame, match.
Yeah.
People will just start fighting,
Mm-hmm.
So that is the nature of art, and that
Mm-hmm.
is the nature of what's happening always.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned it. And thank you for really expanding that thought, because I feel like in this circumstance, it's not to say, oh, how dare they do this to us, censor the truth or anything, but it's almost like you're threading the needle to expand the conversation, to find a way for this message to make its way in some form that is palatable to those existing governments, but still open up the discourse in that particular place. But it seems like you've had plenty of experience looking at certain issues and bringing them to where they don't really feel like they need to be talked about, or maybe that are getting suppressed in some way. Do you feel like that's been your experience in some of these issues that you've tried to address in previous plays? Like people just want to sweep things under the rug?
I think that kind of the opposite, actually,
Oh, okay.
that a lot of times when my plays are done in the US, there's a lot of one of the reactions by the audience is things like, oh, we didn't really understand this topic, or we heard
Mm-hmm.
about the Khmer Rouge, or we heard about mass incarceration of women in the US,
Mm-hmm.
in solitary confinement, but I didn't really quite understand what it meant, or so it generally has the ability to open up um, a dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, or reconfigure uh, thoughts and feelings um, yeah.
Yeah. So you feel like that's never been an issue where there has been contentious dialogue, from any of your work. Most of it has been fairly positive then in terms of the way that you've set up discussion from the work.
Um, hmm,
Or
that's
I guess I'm
interesting.
I'm I'm asking more in terms of backlash. I should say,
Yeah,
whether it's
yeah.
related to a certain issue or if you've experienced something negative like that, and what is to be taken from those experiences if you had
Mm.
any.
Yeah, well, I think an example, a couple examples. My play Lemkin's House, which is about Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide, Polish Jewish lawyer. People would say to me, wow, I wasn't planning to come to see this. I had no interest, or I had no, and I came, and it was funny, and I'm okay after seeing it. So I think that's a hurdle, and yes, you're right. I mean, it's not for everyone. My plays do not. I don't have I don't tie things up loose neatly in a bow, and I've worked with directors who have encouraged me not to do that, and that might not be for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I absolutely think. And then also, Him So P has told me that when we do the revival, he's like, maybe he has mentioned the word happy ending, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so you may, and I'm like, I'm okay with that if that's what, I'm not gonna like, I'm gonna do everything I can to be truthful to the characters,
Uh-huh.
but
Right.
you know, I feel like I need, I want to be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have a couple more questions to be mindful of your time, but this has been amazing so far, and I can't thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm curious of your experience as somebody who has been out in the field, in so many words, to gather oral histories, to be a part of certain communities, and to commune with people who are different than ourselves. And there's that's, I think, a very difficult task sometimes, because you're coming into spaces where people are being vulnerable and sharing a lot of difficult situations and a lot of stories that are not too palatable for some people, and I'm curious how you handle that over the years, because you've been doing this for most, if not all, of your career. And I'm curious what kind of self-care, or how do you handle the kind of emotional intake of the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. And it is something that I have thought about very, very much recently. And it also, so in kind of in terms of thinking about the sum total, um, and also some realizations that came to me, and this is how I feel. I believe that the operating principle for making change and for being a change maker, which is what I hope I can be, is the idea of putting this under the umbrella of human rights. Because I think that I now have the knowledge, simply because I've gone into the sort of micro world of, for example, understanding the complex geopolitical situation in Cambodia and U.S. relations. And so in the micro, and then had enough experience to look at the macro and to know that there are superseding human rights issues, such as women's rights, such as post traumatic stress disorder, that are things that can be addressed without having to get into the minutia of the politics that are beneath it.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that enough to be able to help, in the sense that I can identify what some of these human rights problems are. And I think that if the world could have the chance to look at these things from that standpoint, we would have hopefully more luck in solving some of the issues.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas before, of course, I would get into the weeds completely. Like, you know, when I listened in the 90s to woman after woman in the Cambodians women group tell me their story, which will make me just cry to hear that had I gone right, I would have been killed, and I went left. I mean, over and over and over again, and realizing the just the logistics of what it's like to be a survivor.
Mm-hmm.
Now I don't have to necessarily go down that journey over and over again and listen to, you know, every single story to understand what the larger mechanisms of that is.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel extremely hopeful because I feel like I know that these people are out there because I've met them,
Mm-hmm.
that there are a huge amount of change makers that are out there
Mm-hmm.
that know the same thing and know it even, you know it better, and that we can do it, you know, we
Mm-hmm.
can do it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's just so moving and incredible because it is vital work and it reminds us that there is a world of possibility of change outside of ourselves. And I think for some of us, you know, and I think for outsiders in particular, I've been thinking about this quite a bit because I'm trying to write about it in some way that isn't formulaic or that isn't too superficial. But it's this idea that folks who have suffered, who have gone through a lot, it's hard for them to exist. It's hard for them to operate in a world that sometimes is not designed for them to excel. And for us to share our voice and to be open and start thinking of community, I think that you've maybe I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how somebody can get out of their heads, get out of their own suffering, to move forward and to take on this kind of action, to answer this call to be more socially aware, to look around and see how their perspective as outsiders can help in this discourse. Because I think a lot of folks just, it's difficult to break out. And it seems like you found a way to take the things that might have hurt somebody else in that kind of outsider experience, and you're using it for some amazing things. You're doing a lot.
Well, in answer to that, I would start by saying, you know, I what really obsesses me and what I really am focused on is when you talk about people that feel like outsiders, or the treatment of survivors and the treatment of so many people is so poor and so bad, and the lack of let's just look at the Native American genocide and slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in so until we can truly acknowledge those two things as a country, we there's for me those are the key points. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I say is, of course, people that have been treated that way historically are feeling dispossessed, and they have every right to. And so those are the voices that it's not fair to say we want to hear your voices when you have been absolutely disrespected, you
Exactly.
know.
Yeah.
So then what I want to say to people who have the power is, please have the responsibility to listen and acknowledge.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
as a person who, I think I can say that having heard the voices of people, survivors, and can truly say, like, there's nothing like what I've heard. Have the honor these people,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
And so I think the what I hope. Well, so I want to make it clear that it is absolutely inhumane and a human rights violation in itself to disrespect and to erase and to make people invisible. That's an absolute violation. And
Mm-hmm.
then to turn around and be like, oh, well, we want to hear your voice.
There's a bit of disconnect there. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, lastly, I want to ask you just two more things. And again, I just want to remind folks that Where Elephants Weep is going to be streaming for free, which is a beautiful opportunity that I guess that's going to be April 14th through the 23rd, BroadwayOnDemand.com. Hopefully, everyone who's listening will be able to check that out. But lastly, I just want to ask you, what would you say to young creatives and storytellers who are outsiders, who are trying to be more socially aware, who are trying to find their footing in this very difficult world? What does it take to get started as a socially responsible storyteller who wants to use their art to bring activism to their community?
Yes, I would say you are the future, and by that that is just such an important, like if I'm on a relay race, I'm handing over the baton to you. It is so vital, and your voice is the beautiful voice, and your voice is the only voice that we need right now, and that also sometimes in your gut, in your heart, somewhere you do have that. I've had it before, like that thing where you're like, I know this is what I have to do. And if and I don't say it lightly, if you can follow that, and if you can also find community and find people, you're welcome to, people can find me on my website, just reach out, if you have an idea or whatever, you know, just find those other people, that they always say, like when you're showing a piece of work, show it to a good friend, somebody who's going to be kind, and then, show it to somebody who you trust, who might have a point of view that is going to help you along. Surround yourself with people, a community, and listen. I guess I would say listen, but I'd also say, and be listened to. Allow yourself to be listened to. Don't be invisible, because there is that mechanism out there where powerful people will do that.
It's a wonderful note to end on, but Catherine, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this. And we're just scratching the surface. I mean, you've led such a phenomenal life as an artist, and you have created such worthwhile work that I just want to thank you for reminding us of what is important in terms of what we do as creatives, as theater makers, and also for creating work that activates our conscience. It's so hard to do, and sometimes we can be afraid to get there, but the work that you're creating gives me hope that we can continue to nourish each other and to bring more of these stories to light, because we need to help the voiceless as much as possible. So thank you for everything that you do, and this was just an honor. So I'm just so thankful for your time.
Thank you so much.
Well, you take care, and I will be in touch on the internet really, really soon.
Right. All right. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.